Every day we hear about the devastating effects of climate change, but few seem to be talking about how climate change affects women and girls in particular. That's why in today's episode of Changemakers Live, we're focusing on climate change and gender inequality. I'm Lexi Rodrigo. I'm with the Strategic Communications team at World Vision Canada. And here's my colleague, Karen Lou Season, to introduce today's expert.
Thanks, Lexi. Today, we'll be talking with Sophia Papastavrou, who's a gender technical specialist at World Vision Canada, and she's joining us all the way from Cyprus. Recently, she just spoke at COP27 on gender equitable responses to build climate resilience, and she was also a TEDx speaker in Cyprus in 2015. She has a pretty stacked resume, having worked as the gender technical lead at World Vision International Middle East, Eastern Europe, covering fragile states, and with the World Bank's and the United Nations Good Office's Peace Mission in Cyprus on women, fragile contexts, and peace building. Finally, in 2021, she released her first book, Women's Organizations for Peace, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here.
Hi, Sophia. We have a long list of questions for you, so we'll get right to it. First of all, why are we talking about climate change and gender inequality in one conversation? What is the connection between these two things?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the climate crisis is essentially a story of inequality, and it's looking at those with less power that are actually facing the most serious consequences. And in this case, it's for women and girls, where their gendered roles, particularly harmful gendered roles, also feel the impacts and effects of climate shocks most acutely. And they are also responsible for producing and preparing food, for example, collecting water and wood for heating and cooking, and often traveling a great distance to secure healthcare for themselves and their families. And all these tasks rely heavily on those natural resources, as well as those and we're seeing those vulnerable shifting patterns in our weather that are impacting women and girls.
So what are the specific effects of climate change on women and girls?
Well, what we're seeing is an impact in our work on food systems, for example, that are highlighting those acute vulnerabilities. So climate threats that influence women and girls' ability to obtain and consume nutritious foods. And we know at World Vision Canada that women and girls often eat last and least. The impact on shifts, for example, we've seen with the pandemic disease burden, as we call it, pointing those shifts in patterns in infectious diseases as climate change influences human relationships as well as their relationship with the environment. And finally, we're looking at those many environmental shifts around the world that are rendering our communities inhospitable, those climate and change induced that have forced migration, and many of those vulnerable populations are unable to survive and thrive in their environment.
Now, Sophia, earlier you mentioned that women girls already are eating last and least, and with climate change making it more difficult to find food in some areas, I can assume that that means more malnutrition for women and girls. And we know that when that happens, it's not just the individual women and girls that are affected by this lack of nutrition. There's like a ripple effect. Can you tell us more about this ripple effect of women's and girls' malnutrition?
Right. Well, in our research, we found that women are responsible for 90% of food purchasing and preparation, but due to those power dynamics and harmful gender norms that govern the norms around who gets to eat, that places restrictions on consumptions. So that for people with less power, we are often seeing that women and girls are that central piece. So we're looking also at ripple effects that are associated with food security and gender equality, as well as the same resources and opportunities available for men and boys differ. So as of 2021, we've seen that 150 million more women who are food insecure than men worldwide. And this, combined with the increase in nutritional requirements, increases the disproportionate risk of malnutrition. So for example, it's estimated by 2050, elevated CO2 levels and concentrations could push 138 million people into zinc deficiency, again, increasing those iron deficiency levels, and as a result, changing crop and nutrition and nutrient, density. So we're looking at disproportionate burdens for children, pregnant or lactating women who are at that highest risk groups of those deficiencies. And finally, with an estimated 2 billion people suffering from these deficiencies currently, it's causing a loss of 63 million lives years annually, and that potential will increase.
So I just wanted to follow up and clarify, climate change is exacerbating already existing gender inequality?
Right.
So to follow up, how do traditional gender norms put women and girls at a higher risk for infectious diseases?
For sure. So we're seeing that women and girls face a higher risk for some infectious diseases. That's due to those traditional discriminatory, harmful gender norms that are persistent in gender inequality. We're looking at gender norms that often dictate the activities in which women and girls, men and boys as well, participate. And that has an increased influence on the differential exposure to pathogens. So for instance, women face an increased exposure to malaria, given that they are responsible for water collection. So what we call those gendered activities, like late evening outdoor meal preparation, early morning water collection, breastfeeding outside of bed nets of mosquitoes, increases women's vulnerability to malaria infection compared to men due to partaking in these activities. So those harmful gender norms may also increase exposure to what we've noticed, and waterborne or soil transmitted parasites that launder in clothes and tend to crops. So that increases our risk of Ebola and COVID-19 viruses as well, due to the labor, and caring roles within the family that women hold, that labor burden, as we call it.
Wow, I certainly had never thought of it that way, how just by women carrying out their traditional roles, they are then exposed to more pathogens and they're more likely to catch these diseases. But going back to what you said earlier about climate migration, like we know that because of climate devastation, a lot of families and entire communities are being forced to leave their homes. So, and in that case, are women and girls at higher risk as well in a situation of climate displacement or migration?
Absolutely. So women and girls are subject to the increased vulnerabilities in the context of what we call climate-related and disasters. We have data that indicates that women and children are up to 14 times more likely than men to be killed by such disasters. We are facing malnutrition that is increasingly likely following disaster, whether it's natural disasters or otherwise, that proportionately burden suffering placed on women and children. Those vulnerabilities during climate shocks, in fact, reflect those, again, pre-existing gender inequalities, which are in essence exacerbated during climate shocks as well. And this limits the access of basic services for women and girls.
So how is World Vision involved? How do we and our partners work to reduce the impact of climate change on women and girls?
Right. So the disproportionate burden that the climate crisis has actually exerted on women and girls emphasizes more and more, in fact, for us, the importance of nutrition and also our commitment to gender transformative solutions that build climate resistance and resilience against the impact of climate change. So World Vision Canada and our partners have developed a critical tool that you'll see here called the Gender Transformative Framework for Nutrition, an incredible team and partners that have put this together that navigates the interplay between gender and nutrition and its impact and effects on women and girls within what we see as a complex ecosystem of global challenges. So essentially, the GTFN, as we call it, is at its core an understanding of centralized to addressing the needs of women and girls are agency, resources, and opportunity structures that are essentially fundamental. So as women and girls, for example, increase their agency, they have greater access to control, but also over resources and experience opportunity structures that enable their environment to enjoy those God-given rights And also, finally, the GTFN emphasizes, as you see here, those complex and intersecting challenges that I've outlined previously in those pathways that affect. So we really are emphasizing here that intersectional and gender transformative approach.
Yeah, I think it's very insightful that in order to address women's and girls' nutrition challenges, that we don't just address the malnutrition, but also address the gender inequality at the same time, or as the means to addressing malnutrition. Now, that's a pretty fantastic looking framework. Um, can you think of an example of when that framework was successfully implemented in a project?
Sure, I can give you a brief example, and a very proud project, the Fortifying Equality and Economic and Diversification, otherwise known as FEED, was used. It was a 3-year project implemented by World Vision, Oxfam, and CARE. It was funded by Global Affairs Canada, and this project, and you can see here in the photograph, our Minister of International Development, Honorary Mr. Sajan. He's in South Sudan and where our project was located, visiting. And this particular visit really generated the need of and addressing the issue of the staggering 7.7 million people that are suffering unprecedented levels, catastrophic, levels of food insecurity. So I'm going to circle back to FEED. So FEED was one of the first security projects in South Sudan to intentionally target female farmers and explicitly seeking to transform those traditional power imbalances that I mentioned before towards more equal opportunities for women and working towards, gender equality. And we use a multi-pronged approach to climate adaptation. So we're increasing the agricultural production, diet diversity, and of course the disaster management, and in addition to that, the peace and conflict resolution as well. So in South Sudan, as I mentioned before, we're seeing worsening food insecurity and diet, and women and girls, again, are the most vulnerable and limited to interventions. Particularly of note, I want to mention is our intervention in farmer field schools, which we established to promote new farming systems. So what we call climate smart agriculture practices that are sustainable. But its really key intervention was supporting women in the access and control to resources that they actually needed to increase agricultural production. And of course, you can't do that without the support of men in this. So being transparent in those dialogue to promote and support women in those leadership roles, but also providing them with the decision-making power and responsibility, and including men in that, so that we can improve the collective of bargaining power for women in those settings. Excuse me.
I love how you explained how complex this response is to building climate resilience, and how this response also tackles gender inequality and brings everybody on board. So you described this like one project and the approach that we're taking right now. What else needs to be done to build climate resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we need to keep strengthening women's voices in leadership by increasing those what we call informal spaces. So at the grassroots level, working with women leaders in organizations, and also in those formal decision-making spaces, creating that space. Again, our work with men and boys, as well as faith and traditional leaders, is really key to changing those harmful gender norms, and that women's voices must be heard. Their needs must be met. They have a say in decisions that affect them. So when women and girls have agency, communities benefit. It's working with and listening to and learning from women-led, women rights-driven local organizations to create and also develop climate change and gender equality strategies.
So I'm sure after learning about the magnitude of the problem and the fact that things are being done and that we are making positive change happen in some communities, I'm sure that some of the people who are watching us are fired up and they want to be involved and they want to help. But, I'm an ordinary person, even though I do work at World Vision Canada. But what about the rest of us? How can we help? How can ordinary people across Canada help with climate change and gender inequality?
Well, the first thing is you're all here. You've all tuned in. So thank you for that. But also learning about the relationship between poverty and climate change. What are those impacts? You know, donating to emergency appeals when we issue them in those situations where we see thousands of children are suffering due to this impact of climate change. And of course, recently our gift catalog is out. So giving a wood conserving stove through helping slow changes in local weather patterns by keeping our forests strong. Donating to help drill a well is also another way to help families stay rooted in the climate change piece. I think those are really important, but you're out there and also working with your local governments and with NGOs on the ground is really key.
Thank you so much for like such thorough and thoughtful answers when it comes to how we're approaching building climate resilience in the world's most low-income countries. I did want to ask, because you did just come back from COP27, which is, you know, all the global leaders coming together, talking about how we can just reduce the impact of climate change and build climate resilience. And also, this is just a reminder to our audience, you can give us your questions in the chat box on Facebook or YouTube. Anyway, sorry. Yeah. What are your biggest takeaways from going to this conference? What was like a big highlight for you?
The big highlight. Look, it was for the first time that Canada, the government of Canada, had hosted a Canada Pavilion, and World Vision Canada was there, which was amazing. A privilege and an honor to be there and represent our organization. But for Canada, it's really key. We have a unique opportunity to keep ensuring that women and girls are at the center of our work, that we continue to move forward with our commitment to Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, or FIAP, to including that building up that climate resilience, working with locally led women's rights organizations, those knowledge keepers, local youth groups. Those are really key as well. An increased focus on, I would say, inclusion in climate smart projects. And I would say another takeaway was a call for greater representation of women in grassroots and civil society in that climate action and decision-making spaces. Creating the space to be visible is really key. Finally, increased investing in locally led, women-led, also key, projects that adopt climate smart practices. And again, I have to circle back. World Vision Canada, we are very unique in working with men and boys, but also faith leaders. We've worked for decades in local communities, and we've gained the trust of faith and traditional leaders in working to address those power systems that continue to perpetuate harmful gender norms and limit the access of agency and empowerment of women and girls. So I think those are also key as well. I think I'll leave it at that. I still have so much to say, but I know we're limited for time.
Well, I'm really excited and proud to see that Canada was taking a bigger role at COP27, and that you yourself, Sophia, and another of our colleagues, Merrick, that you were able to share some of our experiences from World Vision, and you mentioned the men, the traditional holders of power and influence. Actually, I was wondering about that. Like, what are we doing to get their buy-in and support in what we're trying to do in dismantling gender inequality?
Well, we have very unique project models that we use within our projects, like Community Voice in Action, like Channels of Hope Gender, where we address scripture with faith leaders and unpack those harmful gender norms that unpack scripture. We also have a men care approach that we are also working with to unpack some of this. But I think the real key here is developing that trust, looking at and working with those traditional knowledge holders and change agents, and also looking at, what is the special role of women and girls in ensuring that children and the rest of their communities have enough food and nutrition. And that is really key, and showcasing that women and girls are powerful agents of change and do play a crucial role in climate adaptation and mitigation risk.
Um, Thank you so much for explaining like all of the just the process and like the big sweeping view of what it means to build climate resilience. I want to take it down a little bit to, I guess, like the granular. You've worked in so many different countries, met so many different people working in these projects. What is a story of a community or a family or a person that impacts you to continue doing the hard work of
For sure.
working with communities today?
Yeah. I can think of the work that we did in the feed project, where we worked with women farmers. And our story for me has been the way that we've been able to support women in access and control. And a story that I can provide is, when we're working with men, and they're specifically women's partners or husbands in this intervention, that they are able to help them within the labor division of the family, so that women farmers have a decreased labor burden, so that they have a more gender equal balance within the household, and that also that they're working together to see that change and that increase of opportunities for women farmers through their increase. So they've seen an increase in agricultural production and also income, and that has really provided, let's say, their agency and empowerment. And there have been so many stories coming out of the project around how with this project, we've been able to decrease early forced marriage, for example. We've addressed violence against women and girls within the project that also impacts the reduced access to food.
I love that. I love that story, and just how women are just being brought to the forefront on the grassroots level of like just making their communities more equitable and equal, and also just building climate resilience in general.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise and your stories. We're really glad that we could learn from you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Sophia. And to those who are watching, if you found this conversation helpful, please do like and share and comment on the video to help us spread the word, and subscribe to this channel whichever platform you're watching, so that you'll be notified the next time we have another live stream and new content. And if you want to learn more about climate change and gender equality or gender inequality, then we have links in the video description. Make sure to click on those to learn more, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.